I'm Edward, delighted to have you with me this evening. A warm greeting tonight to our listeners in Louisiana. Where are you listening from, and do you know how to knit or sew, or have you ever tried your hand at it? Leave a note below and please remember to subscribe. Now, let us begin our gentle mystery. Chapter 1. The Last Alteration on Alderwick Lane. It was on a Thursday morning in early October that Agnes Fuller was discovered in her workroom on Alderwick Lane, sitting quite peacefully in the chair she had occupied for the better part of 40 years. The discovery was made by Mrs. Binns, who came 3 mornings a week to do the rough work, and who had her own key to the side entrance. Mrs. Binns, being a sensible woman not given to hysterics, did not scream or faint or create any of the disturbances one might expect under such circumstances. She simply set down her basket, observed that Miss Fuller was beyond any earthly assistance, and walked with what dignity she could muster to the corner where Dr. Haydock kept his surgery. Dr. Haydock, who had attended Agnes Fuller through various minor ailments over the years, confirmed what Mrs. Binns had already understood. The heart, he explained in his brisk, matter-of-fact way, had simply stopped. It happened, particularly to women of Miss Fuller's age and constitution. 71 was not precisely young, and Agnes had never been what one might call robust. She had lived quietly, worked steadily, and departed with the same lack of fuss that had characterised her entire existence. By mid-morning the news had travelled through St. Mary Mead with that peculiar velocity reserved for village intelligence. It reached Miss Marple as she was deadheading the last of the Michaelmas daisies in her front garden, conveyed by the postman, who had heard it from the baker's boy, who had been told by Mrs. Binns herself when she stopped to purchase 2 currant buns for her nerves. Miss Marple paused in her work, secateurs in hand, and considered the information with the thoughtful attention she gave to all matters concerning her village. Agnes Fuller. Yes, she knew her naturally. One could not live in St. Mary Mead for any length of time without knowing everyone, at least by sight and reputation. Agnes had been the village seamstress, though that term perhaps suggested something grander than the reality. She had been a capable needlewoman who did alterations, mending, and the occasional simple garment for those who preferred personal attention to the ready-made offerings of the larger shops in Much Benham. A quiet woman, Miss Marple reflected, reserved, even by the standards of those who worked with their hands and kept their own counsel. She had occupied the small cottage on Alderwick Lane for as long as anyone could remember, living alone since her mother's death some 20 years previous. No close family remained, only a cousin in Dorset who sent Christmas cards and little else. Miss Marple found herself thinking, as she often did when death touched the village, of the small accumulation of details that constituted a life. The neat cottage with its climbing roses, the workroom window where one could sometimes glimpse the steady movement of Agnes's head as she bent over her stitching, the careful way she carried her shopping basket, never more than she could comfortably manage, the polite nod she offered in passing, friendly but not intimate. It was fortunate everyone agreed when the matter was discussed over tea and in chance meetings throughout the day, that Agnes had gone so peacefully. No suffering, no prolonged illness, no distressing scene for anyone to discover. Simply there one evening and gone the next morning, with her work nearly completed and everything in its proper place. Miss Marple heard these observations repeated with variations throughout the afternoon and found herself troubled by something she could not immediately identify. It was not that she doubted the general sentiment. A peaceful death was indeed preferable to the alternative. And yet there was something in the very tidiness of it that seemed to invite a closer examination. She mentioned as much to her friend Dolly Bantry when that lady called round for tea, having heard the news and feeling the need for what she called a proper discussion of the whole thing. Lady Bantry, whose energy and curiosity were undiminished by the years, settled herself in the chintz armchair with the air of one preparing for a thorough exploration of the subject. She was a handsome woman, still elegant despite her advancing years, with a directness of manner that Miss Marple had always found refreshing. "Poor Agnes," Lady Bantry began, accepting a cup of tea with a milk and 2 lumps of sugar. "Though I suppose one could hardly call it poor, could one, if one must go? Going quietly in one's own chair with one's spectacles on seems rather a good way of managing it." She had her spectacles on, Miss Marple inquired with interest. So Mrs. Binns reported to Mrs. Price, who mentioned it to my cook. Spectacles on, needle-threaded, and a garment pinned to the dressmaker's form beside her, as though she had simply paused for a moment and then decided not to continue. Miss Marple poured her own tea and added a thin slice of lemon. What sort of garment? Lady Bantry looked surprised at the question. I'm not certain the precise details were conveyed. A woman's coat, I believe. Does it matter? Perhaps not, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, though I confess I find myself curious about what Agnes was working on when she died. One's final occupation does seem somehow significant, even if only as a matter of completing the picture. You're being philosophical, Jane, Lady Bantry observed with affection, though I grant you it's a natural enough impulse when someone passes. One does want to feel that everything has been properly attended to, that there are no loose ends. But there were loose ends. Miss Marple discovered the following afternoon when she walked down Alderwick Lane, ostensibly to pay her respects and to offer whatever assistance might be needed with the practical arrangements. The cousin from Dorset, it transpired, was elderly herself and unable to travel. The vicar was seeing to the formalities, and Clara Mayhew, who lived in the cottage adjacent to Agnes's, had kindly offered to sort through the seamstress's effects and ensure that any work in progress was returned to its rightful owners. Clara Mayhew was a young widow, perhaps 35, who had returned to St. Mary Mead some 6 months earlier after the death of her husband. She had been born in the village but had married and moved away, returning only when circumstance and inclination drew her back to familiar surroundings. She was a quietly pretty woman with careful manners and an air of composure that suggested either natural reserve or learned restraint. Miss Marple found her in Agnes's workroom, where she had been making an inventory of the unfinished commissions. The room was exactly as one might expect. A north-facing window for steady light, a large work table, the dressmaker's form that Lady Bantry had mentioned, and shelves neatly organised with thread, fabric remnants, and the various implements of the seamstress's trade. The coat that Agnes had been working on when she died was still pinned to the form. Miss Marple, who had an eye for such things, studied it with interest while Clara explained the situation in her precise, slightly formal manner. I believe this was being altered for someone, Clara said. The waist has been taken in quite substantially, and there are chalk marks indicating further adjustments. I thought perhaps you might know who it belonged to, Miss Marple. I should like to return it naturally, though there's no particular hurry. Miss Marple examined the coat more closely. It was a good quality garment, though not new. Dark blue wool with a modest collar and covered buttons, the sort of thing a woman of modest means but respectable position might wear for church or shopping in town. What struck her as curious was the nature of the alteration itself. Agnes Fuller had been known for plain practical work, repairs, hemming, letting out or taking in when a figure changed. She did not, as a rule, engage in the sort of fashionable reshaping that required skill and imagination. This coat, however, had been altered with uncommon care. The waist had been recut entirely, the darts repositioned, the shoulders adjusted. It was the work of someone who understood not merely how to follow a pattern, but how to create a new line entirely. How interesting, Miss Marple said quietly. I wonder who commissioned such extensive work. Clara Mayhew's expression remained polite and neutral. I'm not certain. Agnes kept few records, at least none that I've discovered. There's a notebook with measurements, but many of the entries lack names. She was discreet, I imagine, Miss Marple observed. People do value discretion in such matters, particularly when alterations might reveal changes in circumstance or figure that they would prefer to keep private. Yes, Clara agreed a little quickly. I'm sure that's quite true. Miss Marple continued to examine the coat, her fingers gentle on the fabric. There was something about it that troubled her, though she could not immediately identify what. The quality of the work, perhaps, or the care with which it had been undertaken for what appeared to be a relatively ordinary garment. She turned to Clara with a pleasant smile. If I can be of any assistance in identifying the owner, do please let me know. I shall make some discreet inquiries if you think it would help." Clara Mayhew thanked her with careful courtesy. Marple took her leave, walking slowly back along Alderwick Lane, with her mind occupied by the image of Agnes Fuller, sitting peacefully in her chair with her spectacles on and her needle threaded, working on a coat that had been altered with quite extraordinary attention. It was, she reflected, exactly the sort of small puzzle that often concealed something larger. Not necessarily anything sinister, of course, but something that someone had preferred to keep private. And Agnes, with her quiet discretion and capable hands, had been precisely the sort of person one would trust with such a secret. The question, Miss Marple thought as she paused to observe a robin on the garden wall, was whether that secret had died with Agnes, or whether it remained, stitched into the fabric of that carefully altered coat, waiting for someone with patience and understanding to read what had been so deliberately concealed. Chapter 2. Pins Left Where They Should Not Be. The sorting of Agnes Fuller's effects proceeded with the unhurried efficiency that characterises such tasks in a village where everyone knows everyone else's business, and where the disposal of a life's accumulation must be done with proper respect and attention to detail. The vicar, Mr. Clement, oversaw the general arrangements, but it was Clara Mayhew who undertook the more intimate work of examining Agnes's possessions and determining what should be kept, what distributed, and what might be passed along to those who could make use of it. Miss Marple, finding herself in the village shop on Saturday morning, encountered Lady Bantry emerging with a basket of provisions and an expression that suggested she had news worth sharing. "Jane, how fortunate, Whodunit," Lady Bantry said with satisfaction. "I've just been hearing the most curious thing from Mrs. Price, who had it from Clara Mayhew, about Agnes's workroom." They fell into step together, walking slowly along the high street in the pale October sunshine. Miss Marple waited with the patience that comes from long experience of village intelligence, knowing that Lady Bantry would arrive at her point in her own time, and that any attempt to hurry her would only prolong the journey. "It's the pins, apparently," Lady Bantry had continued. "Clara noticed them when she was tidying the workroom yesterday afternoon. They were still in the cushion, all of them." Miss Marple considered this information with interest. All of them. Every single one, according to Mrs. Price. And Clara mentioned it particularly because Agnes was known to be most particular about her pins. She always removed them when she'd finished using them, returned them to their proper place, never left them standing in the cushion overnight, said it dulled the points and made them less useful. "I see," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "How many pins were left in the cushion?" 7, I believe, all in a neat row, as though they'd been placed there deliberately. Which of course they had been, but Agnes would normally have removed them once her work was done for the evening. They had reached the corner where Alderwick Lane branched off from the high street, and by unspoken agreement both ladies turned down the quieter road. The October air carried the faint scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, and the hedgerows still held the last scattered blooms of the season. "I suppose," Miss Marple ventured after a moment, "that Agnes might simply have forgotten, if she was feeling unwell or tired." "That's what everyone assumes naturally," Lady Bantry agreed. "Though it does seem odd, doesn't it? To complete one's work to the point of threading a needle, but not to the point of removing one's pins." Miss Marple made a small sound of agreement. She was thinking of the coat she had seen on the dressmaker's form, with its careful alterations and unusual attention to detail. A woman who could execute such precise work was not likely to forget the small rituals that governed her craft, unless of course she had been interrupted, or unless something else had occupied her mind so completely that the ordinary habits of 40 years had been momentarily displaced. They encountered Clara Mayhew herself a few minutes later, emerging from Agnes's cottage with a cardboard box in her arms. She greeted them with her characteristic courtesy, though Miss Marple detected a faint shadow of weariness in her expression. The work of sorting through another person's life, however simple that the life might appear, was never an easy task. "I hope we're not intruding," Miss Marple said gently. Lady Bantry mentioned that you'd been making progress with the arrangements. Yes, thank you, Clara replied. It's going as well as can be expected. The cousin in Dorset has written to say that I may dispose of things as I see fit, since she's unable to come herself. Most of Agnes's personal effects are quite ordinary. Sensible clothes, a few pieces of jewellery, some books, nothing of great value, but all of it well maintained. And the work that was in progress? Miss Marple inquired. Have you been able to identify the owners? Clara set down her box and pushed a strand of hair from her forehead. That's proving rather more difficult than I anticipated. Agnes kept very few records. There's a notebook with measurements, but many of the entries aren't labelled with names. I suppose her clients were known to her, and she saw no need to write down what she already knew. That was the old way, Lady Bantry observed. Before everything had to be written down in triplicate, people simply remembered. Yes, Clara agreed, though it does make matters complicated now. The coat, for instance. I've been examining it more carefully, and I believe I may have been mistaken when I thought it might be mine. The measurements don't quite correspond. Miss Marple felt a small prickle of interest. But you mentioned yesterday that you thought it might belong to you. I did, Clara said, and there was something in her tone that was difficult to identify. Not quite hesitation, but a careful precision, as though she were choosing her words with unusual attention. I have a coat of similar colour, and I had asked Agnes to do some alterations for me several months ago. But when I compared them this morning, I realised they're not the same garment after all. The buttons are different, and the collar. Mine is at home, quite untouched. She paused, and then added with what seemed like deliberate casualness, I suppose someone else in the village must have commissioned the work, though I can't recall the exact date of my own fitting, which makes it difficult to establish a timeline. Miss Marple made a mental note of the careful way Clara phrased this last observation. Cannot recall the exact date. Did not know, or was uncertain, but cannot recall, as though the information existed somewhere in her memory, but had become temporarily inaccessible, or perhaps had been deliberately set aside. Perhaps we might have another look at it, Lady Bantry suggested, with the straightforward enthusiasm that characterised her approach to puzzles. Fresh eyes and all that. Jane has a remarkable memory for details. Clara appeared briefly uncertain, but good manners prevailed. Of course, if you think it might help. They followed her back into Agnes's workroom, where the autumn light fell softly through the north window and illuminated the coat still pinned to the dressmaker's form. Miss Marple approached it slowly, studying it with the same careful attention she might give to a piece of embroidery or a complicated pattern in her knitting. The coat was, as she had noted before, of good quality, dark blue wool, well made but not fashionable. The sort of garment a woman might keep for years, altering it as needed to accommodate changes in figure or style. What she had not examined closely on her previous visit were the chalk marks that traced the lines of alteration across the fabric. How interesting, she murmured, leaning closer. These marks have been altered themselves. Lady Bantry joined her, peering at the faint white lines that crisscrossed the dark wool. What do you mean, altered? Here you see. Miss Marple indicated a section near the waist. There's one set of chalk marks, quite clear and decisive, and then another set, slightly different, drawn over the first, as though the initial fitting had been reassessed and adjusted. Clara Mayhew stood very still, her hands folded before her. Perhaps Agnes changed her mind about the measurements, or the client requested a different fit. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed quietly. She continued her examination, noting the way the darts had been repositioned, the subtle reshaping of the shoulders, the careful adjustment of the waistline. It was meticulous work, the kind that required not one fitting but several, each refining the previous attempt. Lady Bantry had moved to the work table where Agnes's notebook lay open beside a tape measure and a small wooden box of buttons. Jane, come look at this! Miss Marple joined her, and together they examined the neat entries in Agnes's careful handwriting. Measurements, dates, brief notes about fabric and thread. Some entries included names: Mrs. Fielding, Miss Carstairs, young Susan from the post office. Others were marked only with initials or left entirely anonymous. This entry here, Lady Bantry pointed to a line dated 3 weeks earlier. It has measurements but no name. And look, the figures have been written twice, as though Agnes recorded them on 2 separate occasions. Miss Marple studied the notation with interest. The first set of measurements suggested a woman of moderate height and slender build. The second set, written in a slightly different ink as though added at a later date, indicated someone with broader shoulders and a fuller frame. Yet both appeared to be in Agnes's handwriting. 2 different people, Miss Marple said softly. Or perhaps the same person at different times, though 3 weeks seems rather a short interval for such significant changes. She turned back to the coat on its form, considering the chalk marks that had been drawn and redrawn, the pins that had been left standing in their cushion, the careful attention that Agnes Fuller had given to what should have been a routine alteration. There was something here that spoke of more than ordinary work, something that had required discretion and skill and the kind of understanding that came not from pattern books but from a deeper knowledge of human nature and its complications. "Tell me, Clara," she said gently, "did Agnes have many clients who preferred to remain anonymous?" Clara's expression remained composed, but Miss Marple detected the briefest hesitation before she replied. "I really couldn't say, Miss Marple. Agnes was always most discreet about her work. She believed that a seamstress should be like a doctor or a solicitor, privy to private matters but never speaking of them. A very proper attitude," Miss Marple observed, "and one that must have made her valuable to those who required such discretion." They left shortly after, declining Clara's offer of tea with the excuse that they were expected elsewhere. As they walked back along Alderwick Lane, Lady Bantry voiced the question that was surely occupying both their minds. "What do you make of it, Jane?" Miss Marple was silent for a moment, watching a sparrow hop along the garden wall beside them. "I think," she said at last, "that Agnes Fuller was engaged in something rather more complex than a simple alteration, something that required care and secrecy, and I think that Clara Mayhew knows a great deal more about it than she is choosing to say. But nothing dishonest, surely, was Oh no, Miss Marple." Agreed. "Not dishonest, but certainly private. There is a difference, Dolly, a very significant difference." Chapter 3. Miss Marple observes a false hem. It was on the Monday following her visit to Agnes's workroom that Miss Marple found herself presented with an unexpected opportunity. Clara Mayhew appeared at her door shortly after breakfast, carrying the dark blue coat wrapped in brown paper and looking apologetic for the intrusion. "I hope you'll forgive my calling so early," Clara said when Miss Marple opened the door, "but I remembered that you'd expressed interest in the coat, and I wondered if you might look at it more carefully. I've tried to determine who it belongs to, but I confess I'm at rather a loss. You have such a gift for noticing details that others miss." Miss Marple invited her in and settled her in the sitting room with tea and biscuits, though Clara declined both with the same careful politeness that characterised all her interactions. The coat was unwrapped and laid across the back of the sofa where the morning light could fall upon it properly. "I thought," Clara continued, "that if anyone could identify some distinguishing feature that might help us locate the owner, it would be you. Agnes must have known who commissioned the work, but she kept no record of it, and I feel rather responsible for seeing that it's returned." Miss Marple appreciated the delicacy of this approach. Clara was, in effect, asking for help while maintaining the fiction that she herself had no particular knowledge of the garment's history. It was the sort of social manoeuvring that Miss Marple recognised from long experience, the careful dance of someone who wished to learn something without revealing what they already knew. "How kind of you to think of me," Miss Marple said warmly. "Let me have a proper look at it." She took up the coat and examined it with the methodical attention she brought to all such investigations. The fabric was indeed of good quality, though it showed signs of wear at the cuffs and collar. The buttons were ordinary horn, well sewn, but unremarkable. The lining was a sensible cotton twill in a shade of grey that would neither show dirt easily nor stand out as particularly fine. It was when she turned her attention to the hem that Miss Marple made her first significant discovery. How very interesting, she murmured, running her fingers along the bottom edge of the coat. This hem has been altered quite recently. Clara leaned forward slightly, though her expression remained neutral. Altered? Yes, you see here, Miss Marple indicated the stitching. This is Agnes's work, certainly, very neat and even. But what she's done is rather unusual. She's added a false hem to lengthen the coat, rather than simply letting down the original hem. She held up the edge so that Clara could see the construction more clearly. You see how there's a strip of fabric folded up inside? It's been inserted to give additional length without actually unpicking the original hemline. A false hem, we used to call it. Quite clever, really, and it preserves the fabric beautifully, but it's an odd choice for someone simply wanting a coat made longer. Why odd? Clara asked, and there was genuine curiosity in her voice now, overlaying the careful tone. Miss Marple sat down with the coat across her lap, smoothing the fabric thoughtfully. Because the usual approach, if one wishes to lengthen a garment, is simply to let down the existing hem. It's quicker, simpler, and unless the original hemline has left a mark, it's quite invisible. A false hem like this one takes more time and more skill. One would only do it if there were a particular reason. What sort of reason? To disguise the original proportions of the coat, Miss Marple said quietly. You see, by adding length without disturbing the original hem, Agnes has made it possible to restore the coat to its previous state quite easily. One would simply remove the false hem and the garment would return to its original length. It's the sort of technique one might use if the alteration were meant to be temporary, or if one wished to preserve the possibility of changing back. She turned the coat over, examining the lining with equal attention. The grey cotton was smooth and well fitted, but as she ran her fingers along the seams, she detected small irregularities, tiny holes where pins or stitches had once been placed and later removed. The lining tells its own story, Miss Marple observed, more to herself than to Clara. It's been pinned and repinned, adjusted and readjusted. You can feel the impressions here, where someone, perhaps Agnes herself, perhaps someone else, has marked the fabric for alterations that were either made and then undone, or contemplated, but never completed. Clara was silent, her hands folded in her lap. Miss Marple glanced at her and saw that she was watching with an expression of careful attention, as though weighing each observation against some private knowledge. Agnes was known for practical work, Miss Marple continued gently, mending straightforward alterations, letting out or taking in when necessary. This coat represents something quite different. This is the work of someone who understood not just how to alter a garment, but how to transform it while preserving the possibility of transformation back again. She set the coat aside and looked directly at Clara. My dear, I think this coat has a rather more complex history than a simple alteration for length or fit, and I think you know something of that history. Clara met her gaze steadily. What makes you think so? Because you brought it to me, Miss Marple said simply. If you truly wished only to identify the owner and return it, you would have donated it to the church jumble or set it aside for the cousin in Dorset to deal with. But instead, you brought it here, to someone you knew would examine it closely. That suggests to me that you want the truth to emerge, but perhaps not through any direct revelation on your part. There was a long moment of silence. Through the window, Miss Marple could hear the familiar sounds of the village morning, the rattle of the milk cart, the distant bark of a dog, the cheerful call of Mrs. Dane to her neighbour across the fence. Ordinary sounds, reassuring in their regularity, providing a gentle counterpoint to the quiet tension in the sitting room. I knew Agnes fairly well, Clara said at last, her voice carefully measured. Not intimately, perhaps, but well enough to understand that she was someone who could be trusted with confidences. She had that quality that some people possess, the ability to see what needed to be done and to do it without judgment or unnecessary questions. A valuable quality, Miss Marple agreed. Yes, and I think that quality sometimes placed her in a position of knowing things that others preferred to keep private. Not scandalous things necessarily, just private. The sort of matters that affect people's lives in ways that outsiders wouldn't understand or couldn't appreciate. Like the fact that this coat was not originally intended to look as it does now? Clara's expression flickered briefly, revealing something that might have been relief or recognition. Yes, like that. Miss Marple returned her attention to the coat, examining the collar and shoulders with renewed interest. The shoulders had been adjusted, she now noticed, taken in slightly and reshaped. The collar, too, showed signs of alteration. Not dramatic, but significant enough to change the line of the garment, to make it sit differently on the wearer. Agnes was transforming this coat, she said thoughtfully. Not simply altering it for a better fit, but actually changing its character, making it suitable for someone different from the person who had originally worn it, and doing so in a way that could be reversed when the time came. You seem very certain of that interpretation, Clara observed. I've seen it before, Miss Marple, Whodunit said, and there was a note of distant memory in her voice. Not precisely this situation, of course, but similar circumstances. There was a case many years ago in our village, a young woman who needed to alter her appearance temporarily for reasons that were entirely respectable, but which she preferred to keep private. The local seamstress helped her, much as Agnes has helped someone here. These things do happen, my dear, more often than one might suppose. People's lives are not always as straightforward as they appear, and sometimes they require assistance of a very particular kind. She folded the coat carefully and placed it on the sofa beside her. I wonder if I might ask you something, Clara. Not about the coat specifically, but about Agnes herself. Did you know her before you returned to St. Mary Mead? Or did you only become acquainted after you came back to the village? Clara hesitated, and in that hesitation, Miss Marple found her answer. We had corresponded, Clara said, finally. Some years ago, when I was living elsewhere, she had helped me with a matter that required discretion, and I'd written to thank her. We maintained a sporadic correspondence after that. Nothing regular, just the occasional letter when circumstances prompted it. And when you returned to the village, you renewed the acquaintance? Yes, I took the cottage next to hers quite deliberately. I wanted to be nearby in case she needed assistance. She was getting on in years, after all, and had no close family. Miss Marple nodded slowly, piecing together the pattern that was emerging from these careful revelations. So you knew her work, her methods, her discretion, and when she died, you knew that among her effects there might be things that required careful handling. Yes, Clara said simply, including this coat. Including this coat. Miss Marple looked at the young widow with sympathy and understanding. My dear, I think you find yourself in a rather difficult position. You wish to protect whatever confidence Agnes was keeping, but you also wish to see that the matter is resolved properly. You cannot do both without revealing more than you feel comfortable revealing. Hence your bringing the coat to me. Clara's composure wavered slightly. I don't know what to do, Miss Marple. Agnes would have known how to manage it. She had a gift for these things. But I'm not Agnes, and I'm afraid of making matters worse through well-intentioned interference. Then perhaps, Miss Marple suggested gently, we should proceed slowly and carefully, allowing the truth to emerge in its own time. After all, Agnes worked in silence for a reason. Not to conceal wrongdoing, I think, but to protect someone's dignity and privacy. We should endeavour to do the same. Clara's expression showed clear relief. Thank you. I was hoping you would understand. Oh, my dear, I do understand, Miss Marple assured her. Better perhaps than you realise. Now, I think we should have that tea after all, and you can tell me whatever you feel comfortable telling me about Agnes and her work. Between us, I'm sure we can determine how best to proceed. And as Clara finally accepted the cup of tea and began hesitantly to speak, Miss Marple reflected that some puzzles reveal themselves not through dramatic revelation, but through patient observation and the gradual accumulation of small truths, stitched together like the careful seams of a well-made garment. Chapter 4. Measurements taken twice. The discovery of Agnes's notebook proved to be a matter of some delicacy. Miss Marple had not asked Clara directly about it during their tea, sensing that trust was something that needed to be earned rather than requested. But 2 days later, on a Wednesday afternoon when the October weather had turned grey and damp, Clara appeared at Miss Marple's door once more, this time carrying a small leather-bound volume that Miss Marple recognised immediately as the sort of record book that careful tradespeople kept. "I've been thinking about what you said," Clara began without preamble, once they were settled in the sitting room, with the curtains drawn against the drizzle, "about allowing the truth to emerge in its own time, and I wondered if you might look at this. It's Agnes's workbook. I've been studying it myself, trying to make sense of certain entries, but I think I may be too close to the matter to see clearly." Miss Marple accepted the notebook with appropriate solemnity. It was a modest thing, cloth-covered and well-worn, with the edges softened by years of handling. Inside, Agnes's handwriting marched across the pages in neat columns. Dates, measurements, brief descriptions of work undertaken, and occasionally a note about fabric or thread. "What is it that troubles you?" Miss Marple asked gently, turning the pages with care. Clara leaned forward, her hands clasped in her lap. "There's an entry from late September. No name attached, only measurements. And if you look carefully, you'll see that the measurements have been recorded twice." Miss Marple found the entry without difficulty. It was dated September the 23rd, just over 2 weeks before Agnes's death. The first set of measurements was written in Agnes's familiar hand. Height, bust, waist, hip, shoulder, width, sleeve length, all perfectly ordinary. But below these, in what appeared to be the same handwriting but with slightly different ink, was a second set of measurements that told quite a different story. 2 different figures entirely, Miss Marple observed. The first suggests a woman of moderate build and average height. The second indicates someone considerably larger through the shoulders and fuller in the frame. "Yes," Clara said quietly, "and both sets are in Agnes's hand, which means she must have recorded them on 2 separate occasions. But why would she need 2 entirely different sets of measurements for the same commission?" Miss Marple studied the figures thoughtfully, her mind turning over the possibilities. Unless they weren't for the same commission at all, or unless the commission involved transforming a garment from one fit to another. She looked up to find Clara watching her with an expression that mixed hope with apprehension. "You think the coat, the one with the false hem, was the subject of this entry?" "I think it very likely," Miss Marple replied. "The dates correspond, and the nature of the work suggests exactly the sort of transformation that would require 2 distinct sets of measurements, one for the garment as it currently exists, and one for the garment as it was originally intended." Clara was silent for a moment, then spoke with careful precision. "Agnes told me once that the most difficult alterations were those that required undoing, that it was harder to restore something to its original state than it was to change it in the first place, because one had to work around all the previous modifications while still maintaining the integrity of the fabric." "A wise observation," Miss Marple said, "and one that suggests considerable experience with such work." She returned her attention to the notebook, turning the pages slowly and examining the other entries with equal care. Most were straightforward, names she recognised from the village, dates that made sense, measurements that told the simple story of hems raised or lowered, waists adjusted, sleeves shortened. The ordinary commerce of a seamstress's life recorded without drama or embellishment. But scattered among these routine entries were others that lacked names. Some were initialed, others marked only with a symbol or date. Miss Marple counted 7 such entries over the past year, each involving work that seemed more complex than the usual alterations. Agnes had other clients who valued discretion, she observed. These entries here and this one, all anonymous or nearly so, all involving work that required more than simple mending. "Yes," Clara acknowledged. "I noticed those as well. I believe Agnes had developed something of a reputation for handling delicate matters, not just in St. Mary Mead, but in the surrounding villages as well. People came to her when they needed work done that they preferred not to discuss openly." "And you were one of those people?" Miss Marple said gently. It was not quite a question. Clara met her gaze directly. "Many years ago, yes, when I lived here as a girl, before my marriage." Agnes helped me with something that required both skill and discretion. I never forgot her kindness." Miss Marple nodded, understanding more than was said. "And so when you returned to the village and found yourself living beside her, you felt a natural concern for her welfare, and perhaps a desire to reciprocate her earlier kindness." "Yes, though I'm not sure I've done very well at it. Agnes was far better at managing these matters than I shall ever be." The rain had intensified, pattering against the window with a soothing rhythm. Miss Marple rose and lit the lamp on the side table, casting a warm glow across the sitting room. The afternoon was drawing in early, as October afternoons do, and the cosy light seemed to encourage confidences. "Tell me," Miss Marple said, settling herself once more, "did Agnes receive many visitors in the weeks before her death?" "Not that I observed," Clara replied, "though of course I wasn't watching her constantly. I have my own household to attend to, but I don't recall seeing anyone call at unusual hours, if that's what you're asking. And yet someone must have come for fittings, 2 separate occasions at minimum, to account for the 2 sets of measurements." Clara considered this. "Agnes did sometimes go out in the evenings. She would tell me she was visiting a friend in Much Benham, or attending to business at the church hall. I thought nothing of it at the time. She was quite independent, despite her age." Miss Marple felt a small stirring of interest. "The church hall, that's rather a curious location for a fitting, wouldn't you say?" "I suppose it might seem so, though it does have a small room in the back that's sometimes used for private meetings. The church warden has a key, and he's quite accommodating about lending it out for various purposes." "The church warden," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "That would be Edwin Lorimer, I believe." "Yes, a most respectable gentleman. Very active in church affairs, always organising things. He's been church warden for as long as I can remember." Miss Marple made a mental note of this information. Edwin Lorimer had not yet featured prominently in her considerations, but the mention of the church hall and his control over its access suggested possibilities worth exploring. A fitting conducted in such a location, rather than in Agnes's own workroom, implied a desire for privacy that went beyond the usual discretion. She turned to another page in the notebook and found what she was looking for, a small notation in the margin, beside the September entry. It was barely legible, written in pencil rather than ink, as though Agnes had recorded it as a reminder to herself rather than as part of the official record. "E.L. arrange space," Miss Marple read aloud. "Would those initials be Edwin Lorimer's, do you suppose?" Clara leaned over to look, and Miss Marple saw recognition flash across her face. "I imagine so. I can't think who else it might be." "So Mr. Lorimer arranged for the use of the church hall for a fitting," Miss Marple said slowly, assembling the pieces. "A fitting that required 2 sets of measurements and resulted in work of considerable complexity and discretion. That suggests rather more involvement than simply lending a key, doesn't it?" "I really couldn't say, Miss Marple. I don't know the details of Agnes's arrangements with her clients, but there was something in Clara's tone that suggested she knew more than she was willing to state directly. Miss Marple had heard that particular inflection many times before, the sound of someone being truthful in their words while allowing a larger truth to remain unspoken. She closed the notebook and held it for a moment, thinking, "My dear, I wonder if you would permit me to make some inquiries. Nothing intrusive, you understand, simply a few quiet questions among people who might have information relevant to understanding Agnes's final commission." Clara appeared both relieved and anxious. "You won't cause any scandal, will you? Whatever Agnes was doing, I'm quite certain it was respectable. She wouldn't have participated in anything improper." "Of that I have no doubt," Miss Marple assured her. "Agnes Fuller was clearly a woman of principle and discretion. Whatever confidence she was keeping, she kept it for good reason. I merely wish to understand what that reason was, so that we can ensure the matter is concluded as she would have wished." "Then yes," Clara said quietly. "Please do make inquiries. I confess I'm rather out of my depth. Agnes would have known exactly how to handle this, but I don't have her experience or her judgment." After Clara had departed, taking the notebook with her, but leaving Miss Marple with a great deal to consider, Miss Marple sat for some time in the gathering darkness, watching the rain streak down the window and thinking about measurements taken, twice about fittings conducted in church halls, and about the sort of secrets that required a seamstress's skill and silence. She thought too about Edwin Lorimer, the genial churchwarden who arranged spaces and presumably asked no questions, about the careful way Clara spoke of matters she clearly understood but would not directly reveal, and about Agnes Fuller, who had stitched in silence and died with her work unfinished, leaving others to puzzle out what she had so deliberately concealed. The truth, Miss Marple reflected, often lay not in what was said but in what was carefully left unsaid, and in this case there was a great deal being left unsaid indeed. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay a visit to Mrs. Phelps, the dress shop proprietor in Much Benham. Mrs. Phelps had been mentioned in passing during earlier conversations, and Miss Marple had learned long ago that those who worked in similar trades often knew things about each other that never reached the general public. If Agnes had been keeping odd hours or undertaking unusual work, Mrs. Phelps might well have noticed, and might, with the right prompting, be persuaded to share what she knew. The rain continued its gentle drumming against the windows, and Miss Marple rose to draw the curtains more firmly closed, shutting out the wet October evening and the questions that multiplied with each new revelation. Chapter 5: A Client Who Paid in Advance. The bus to Much Benham departed from the crossroads at 10:30 on Thursday mornings, and Miss Marple made a point of being there with several minutes to spare. She carried her shopping basket and wore her second-best coat, the one appropriate for errands rather than formal calls, and to any casual observer she appeared to be engaged in nothing more purposeful than the weekly expedition that many of the village ladies undertook to the larger shops in town. Much Benham was not precisely a metropolis, but it offered amenities that St. Mary Mead could not provide. A proper draper's, a lending library, a tea shop of some refinement, and Mrs. Phelps's establishment, which occupied a narrow storefront on the high street and advertised itself as purveyors of ready-made garments and bespoke alterations. Miss Marple had met Mrs. Phelps on several occasions over the years, though they had never progressed beyond the cordial acquaintance that characterized such business relationships. Mrs. Phelps was a brisk woman in her late 50s, handsome in a severe way, with iron-grey hair dressed in an uncompromising style and an air of commercial competence that discouraged time-wasting. She ran her shop with efficiency and took evident pride in the quality of her stock. The shop was quiet when Miss Marple entered, with only one other customer, a young woman examining a display of gloves, and Mrs. Phelps herself behind the counter, marking items in a ledger with decisive strokes of her pen. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Phelps greeted her with professional warmth. "How pleasant to see you. Are you looking for anything in particular this morning?" "Nothing specific," Miss Marple replied, allowing her gaze to travel over the neatly arranged merchandise. "Though I confess I'm partly here because I was thinking of poor Agnes Fuller. I understand you knew her professionally." Mrs. Phelps's expression shifted subtly, though from surprise or some other emotion was difficult to determine. "Yes, indeed, a terrible loss, though I suppose at her age one must be prepared for such things. She went peacefully, I understand." "Very peacefully," Miss Marple agreed. "Almost as though she had simply stopped in the middle of her work for a moment's rest, though of course she never resumed it." "One hopes we might all go as quietly," Mrs. Phelps observed, setting aside her ledger. "Agnes was a capable needlewoman. We were never precisely competitors, you understand. Her clientele and mine occupied rather different spheres, but we had a professional respect for each other." Miss Marple selected a card of buttons and examined them with apparent interest. "I imagine you knew her methods fairly well, then, whether she kept regular hours, what sort of work she preferred." Mrs. Phelps's eyes narrowed slightly, though her tone remained cordial. "I wouldn't say I knew her intimately. We encountered each other from time to time at the draper's when we were both purchasing supplies, and occasionally someone would mention having commissioned work from her, but we didn't discuss our business practices, if that's what you're asking." "Oh no, nothing so formal," Miss Marple assured her. "I was merely curious. You see, I've been helping young Clara Mayhew sort through Agnes's effects, and we've been trying to identify the owners of several unfinished commissions. It occurred to me that you might have heard something, village talk, or perhaps a customer mentioning having taken work to Agnes. Mrs. Phelps moved to the window, ostensibly to adjust a display of scarves, but Miss Marple suspected it was more to gain a moment to consider her response. When she turned back, her expression was carefully neutral. I did hear something, actually. Nothing specific, you understand, but Mrs. Carmichael, she keeps the post office, mentioned in passing that Agnes had been keeping odd hours the week before her death, coming and going at unusual times, that sort of a thing. How interesting, Miss Marple said. I wonder how Mrs. Carmichael would have known that. The post office isn't particularly close to Alderwick Lane. Her sister lives opposite the lane, Mrs. Phelps explained, perhaps a shade too quickly. She notices things as sisters do, not that there's anything improper in keeping odd hours. Agnes was her own mistress, and perfectly entitled to work when she pleased. Of course, Miss Marple agreed mildly, though it does seem rather unusual for someone of Agnes's age and habits. She was quite regular in her ways, I understand. Mrs. Phelps returned to her position behind the counter, her hands folding together in a gesture that suggested the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. But Miss Marple was not quite finished. I wonder, she said, selecting a spool of thread from the display and turning it over in her hands, whether you ever had occasion to discuss with Agnes the technical aspects of alterations, the more complex work, I mean, the sort that requires real skill and understanding. There was a pause, and when Mrs. Phelps spoke, her voice had lost some of its professional smoothness. Why do you ask? Only because I've been examining one of her final commissions, a coat that was being quite extensively altered. The work is remarkably sophisticated, far beyond the simple repairs and adjustments that Agnes usually undertook. It made me wonder whether she had consulted anyone about the techniques involved. Mrs. Phelps' expression underwent a subtle transformation. The commercial mask slipped slightly, revealing something that might have been discomfort or perhaps caution. Agnes came to see me once, she said slowly, several years ago. She wanted advice about a particular type of alteration, quite an unusual request. Miss Marple waited, understanding that silence was sometimes the most effective encouragement. She asked, Mrs. Phelps continued, about the possibility of cutting down a man's coat to fit a woman, not simply making it smaller, you understand, but actually reconstructing it so that the proportions would be correct for a female figure. I told her it was technically possible, but extremely difficult. The shoulders would need to be completely rebuilt, the chest altered, the waist repositioned. It would be easier to make a new garment entirely. And did she say why she needed to know? No. Agnes never explained her reasons. She simply thanked me for the information and left. I assumed at the time that she had a client with some unusual requirement, though I couldn't imagine what. One doesn't typically reconstruct men's clothing into women's garments. It would be far more practical to sell the man's coat and purchase an appropriate woman's coat with the proceeds. Unless, Miss Marple suggested gently, the specific coat in question had some particular significance, or unless the reconstruction itself served a purpose beyond simple economy. Mrs. Phelps looked at her sharply. What are you suggesting, Miss Marple? Nothing in particular, Miss Marple replied with a pleasant smile. Merely exploring possibilities. Agnes's final commission has raised several questions, and I'm trying to understand the full picture. Did she ever mention that conversation to you again? No, we never discussed it after that day, though now that you mention it, I did see her in town several months ago, and she had that look about her, you know the one I mean, when someone is absorbed in a complex piece of work and thinking about nothing else. She barely acknowledged my greeting, which was unlike her. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Phelps for her time and made a small purchase, the spool of thread and 2 cards of hooks and eyes, before taking her leave. She had learned what she had come to learn, though the information raised as many questions as it answered. The tea shop on the corner provided a welcome respite before the return journey, and Miss Marple settled herself at a table by the window with a pot of tea and a slice of seed cake. As she sipped her tea, she reflected on the curious accumulation of details surrounding Agnes Fuller's final work. A coat altered with unusual skill and care. Measurements taken twice, suggesting a transformation from one state to another. Fittings conducted in the church hall rather than in Agnes's own workroom. And now this intriguing piece of information about reconstructing men's clothing for women's wear. The picture was becoming clearer, though significant pieces remained obscure. It was as she was preparing to leave that she encountered Edwin Lorimer himself, entering the tea shop with the air of a man in need of refreshment after completing morning errands. He was a tall, well-built gentleman in his early 60s, with a genial face and the comfortable manner of someone accustomed to being liked and respected. His position as churchwarden gave him a certain standing in the community, and he carried it with natural authority. "Miss Marple," he greeted her warmly. "What a pleasant surprise. I trust you're well." "Quite well, thank you, Mr. Lorimer." "And yourself?" "Tolerably well, tolerably well. I've been seeing to some matters for the church, the autumn fit, and various repairs that need attention before winter sets in. The usual business." They exchanged pleasantries for a few moments, and Miss Marple was about to take her leave when something prompted her to mention Agnes Fuller's death. "A sad loss," Edwin agreed, his expression becoming appropriately solemn. "Though, as you say," she went peacefully, "which is a blessing. I had the honour of knowing her fairly well through our church activities. A most respectable and capable woman." "I understand you are kind enough to arrange for her to use the church hall on occasion," Miss Marple observed. "For her work, I mean." Edwin's expression remained pleasant, but Miss Marple detected a brief flicker of something, surprise perhaps, or wariness, before he responded. "Did I? I'm afraid I don't recall the specific instance. I'm often arranging use of the hall for various purposes. It's part of my role as churchwarden." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed. "I merely mentioned it because Clara Mayhew remembered your kindness in that regard. Agnes apparently conducted a fitting there some weeks ago." "Ah, yes, that's quite possible. I do recall lending the key on one or two occasions. For convenience, you understand. Agnes occasionally needed more space than her small workroom provided, particularly when dealing with larger garments or multiple fittings at once." His explanation was perfectly reasonable, delivered with easy confidence, and yet Miss Marple found herself wondering about the emphasis he placed on certain words. For convenience, larger garments, multiple fittings, each phrase suggested a mundane explanation while leaving room for something more complex beneath the surface. "Well, it was thoughtful of you," she said warmly. "Agnes must have appreciated having access to a more spacious venue." "I like to help where I can," Edwin replied. "The church is there to serve the community, after all. If lending a key for an evening can assist a hard-working tradeswoman, it's the least I can do." They parted cordially, and Miss Marple made her way to the bus stop with much to occupy her thoughts. The morning's inquiries had yielded useful information, though it all pointed toward a conclusion that was still tantalizingly out of reach. As the bus rattled back towards St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple gazed out at the October countryside and assembled the pieces in her mind. A coat transformed with skill and discretion, a churchwarden who arranged private space, a seamstress who kept confidences and died with her work unfinished, and somewhere in all of this, a payment made in advance, generous and unusual, suggesting that whatever service Agnes had provided, it had been valued highly indeed. The question now was not what Agnes had been doing, but for whom, and why the matter required such elaborate precautions to keep it private. Chapter 6. The Dress That Was Never Collected. The following week brought unseasonably fine weather to St. Mary Mead, the sort of golden October days that seem almost an apology for the rain that has preceded them. Miss Marple took advantage of the sunshine to work in her garden, though she found her attention wandering from the border she was weeding to the puzzle that Agnes Fuller's death had presented. It was Lady Bantry who brought news of the latest development, arriving on Friday afternoon with the air of someone bearing intelligence of significance. "Jane, the most peculiar thing," she announced, settling herself in the garden chair that Miss Marple had positioned beneath the apple tree. "The coat still hasn't been claimed. Clara Mayhew mentioned it to Mrs. Price, who told my cook, who naturally informed me, a full fortnight since Agnes died, and no one has come forward to collect it. Miss Marple set aside her trowel and removed her gardening gloves. That is interesting. One would think the owner would be anxious to retrieve it, particularly if they'd paid for the alterations. That's precisely what I thought, though Clara did say something rather odd. She said she'd put the word about quietly, not making a public announcement, you understand, but mentioning it to various people who might have had dealings with Agnes. And still, nothing. How did Clara phrase these inquiries, Papa? Miss Marple asked. The wording might be significant. Lady Bantry frowned in concentration. According to Mrs. Price, Clara said something like, if anyone had commissioned work from Agnes that they've not yet collected, she would be happy to return it. Perfectly reasonable, wouldn't you say? Perfectly reasonable, Miss Marple agreed, and yet phrased in such a way that someone who wished to remain anonymous could easily fail to respond without drawing attention to themselves. You think Clara phrased it deliberately to allow that? I think Clara is being very careful indeed. She wishes to resolve the matter properly, but she also wishes to protect whatever confidence Agnes was keeping. It's rather an impossible position when one considers it. How does one return property to someone who's gone to great lengths to ensure their identity remains unknown? Lady Bantry accepted a cup of tea from the tray that Miss Marple had brought out earlier. You know, Jane, I've been thinking about this whole business, and I can't help wondering if we're not making too much of it. Perhaps the coat simply belonged to someone who's moved away or died themselves, or someone who's decided they don't want it after all and can't be bothered to collect it. Those are all possibilities, Miss Marple acknowledged, though they don't quite account for the nature of the alterations themselves or the care with which Agnes approached the work. This wasn't a routine commission that someone might casually abandon. She poured her own tea and added lemon with precise attention. No, Dolly, I think the coat represents something more significant, and I think Clara knows it, which is why she's been so careful in her handling of the matter. What will she do with it then? She can't keep it indefinitely. She mentioned to me that she was considering donating it, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. To the church jumble, most likely. A perfectly sensible solution on the surface. But not really a solution at all, Lady Bantry observed shrewdly, because the moment it appears at the jumble sale, everyone will see it and recognise it as the mysterious coat from Agnes's workroom. The speculation would be tremendous. Quite so, which is why I suspect Clara suggested it as a sort of test. See how various people would react to the idea. And how did they react? That, Miss Marple said with a slight smile, is the question I've been pondering myself. Unfortunately, I haven't been present for most of these conversations. I've only heard the reports second-hand, which is never quite the same thing. She set down her teacup and looked across the garden, where late roses still bloomed against the wall. You know, Dolly, there's something my great-aunt used to say. She was a very wise woman, though terribly eccentric. She said that the things people give away often reveal more about them than the things they keep, because giving something away requires a deliberate act of separation, a conscious decision to remove something from one's life, and the manner of that giving, whether it's done openly or quietly, generously or reluctantly, tells its own story. You think someone wants the coat to be given away? I think someone would prefer the coat to disappear quietly into general circulation, rather than remain a focus of attention and speculation, which suggests to me that the coat itself, or more precisely what it represents, is something they wish to move beyond. Lady Bantry was silent for a moment, digesting this observation. Then she said slowly, "The village has been rather full of theories, you know. Mrs. Dane thinks it was for a secret assignation, someone disguising themselves to meet a lover. Young Susan from the post office believes it involved theatrical costume, though why anyone would need a seamstress for that when they have a perfectly good amateur dramatic society with its own wardrobe mistress, I cannot fathom. And Mr. Hawkins at the pub suggested it might have been connected to some sort of deception for financial advantage, though he wouldn't elaborate on what he meant. Each theory resting on assumption rather than observation, Miss Marple noted, which is the danger of speculation. People construct narratives based on what they would do or what they imagine others might do, rather than on what actually occurred. What do you think occurred, Jane? Miss Marple considered the question carefully before answering. I think Agnes helped someone with a transformation, not a deception exactly, but a change from one state to another. Something that required not just skill with needle and thread, but understanding and discretion. And I think that whatever she was helping with, it was deeply personal and potentially vulnerable to judgment or misunderstanding. You're being very cryptic. I'm being cautious, Miss Marple corrected gently. Because I'm dealing with someone's private matter, and I don't wish to cause harm through careless speculation. Agnes understood that, which is why she kept silent. I should endeavour to do the same until I'm more certain of my ground. Lady Bantry accepted this with good grace, though her expression suggested she would have preferred more concrete revelations. They sat in companionable silence for a time, watching the play of sunlight through the apple tree's branches and listening to the distant sounds of village life, the rattle of a cart, the call of children at play, the church bell marking the hour. It was as they were preparing to go inside that they encountered Clara Mayhew walking past the garden gate. She paused when she saw them, and Miss Marple noted the slight hesitation before she offered a greeting. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple, Lady Bantry. What lovely weather we're having." "Do come in for a moment," Miss Marple invited. "We were just discussing the various matters that require attention, and I confess I've been meaning to ask you something." Clara entered through the side gate with visible reluctance, and Miss Marple wondered what it was that made her so wary. Not guilt, surely, but perhaps apprehension about what might be revealed or discussed. "It's about the coat," Miss Marple said, once they were all seated. "Lady Bantry mentioned that you're considering donating it if no one claims it. I wondered if you'd given thought to an alternative." "What sort of alternative?" Clara asked carefully. "Simply returning it to its original state, removing the alterations that Agnes made, and restoring the garment to what it was before she began her work. Then the coat might be given away without any particular attention being drawn to it." Clara's expression underwent a subtle transformation. "I hadn't thought of that, though I'm not certain I have the skill to undo Agnes's work properly. She was far more accomplished than I am." "Mrs. Phelps in Much Benham is quite capable," Miss Marple suggested. "She could certainly manage the alterations, and if the coat were returned to its original form, it would simply be an ordinary blue wool coat of interest to no one." "Yes," Clara said slowly. "Yes, that would be a solution, wouldn't it? Though I should need to find the original measurements to ensure the restoration was accurate." "I imagine Agnes kept records," Miss Marple said mildly. "2 sets of measurements, perhaps. One for the altered state and one for the original." Clara met her gaze directly, and in that moment Miss Marple saw acknowledgement pass between them, an understanding that both knew more than was being said and that both were endeavouring to reach the same conclusion through different paths. "I'll look through Agnes's notebook again," Clara said quietly, "and perhaps I'll take the coat to Mrs. Phelps next week. You're quite right, Miss Marple. Sometimes the best solution is simply to restore things to what they were before complications arose." After Clara had departed, Lady Bantry turned to Miss Marple with raised eyebrows. "Well, that was illuminating." "Was it?" Miss Marple asked innocently. "You know perfectly well it was. You've just told Clara how to dispose of the coat without revealing anything about why it needed to be altered in the first place. Very clever, Jane, though I must say I'm still completely in the dark about what this is all about." "Patience, Dolly," Miss Marple said, beginning to gather the tea things. "The truth has a way of emerging when the time is right, and sometimes the kindest thing we can do is ensure that it emerges gently, without causing unnecessary distress. You're being cryptic again." "I'm being considerate," Miss Marple corrected. "There's a difference." And with that she led the way back into the cottage, leaving Lady Bantry to follow with the resigned expression of someone who knew better than to press for answers before her friend was ready to provide them. Chapter 7. Voices that spoke too precisely. Sunday service at St Mary Mead's Parish Church provided Miss Marple with an opportunity for observation that had nothing to do with spiritual contemplation. She had always found that the manner in which people conducted themselves in church, their choice of pew, their degree of attention to the sermon, their interactions during the social gathering afterward, revealed as much about character as more dramatic circumstances might. Edwin Lorimer, as church warden, occupied his customary position near the front, and Miss Marple noted the easy confidence with which he performed his various duties. He was a man comfortable with ritual and order, someone who understood the importance of maintaining proper forms. During the announcements, he spoke with genial authority about the upcoming autumn fete and the need for volunteers to assist with the flower rota. Clara Mayhew sat several rows behind, her posture suggesting attentive devotion, without ostentation. She sang the hymns in a pleasant, unassuming voice and listened to the vicar's sermon with the appearance of genuine interest. Nothing about her behaviour suggested anything other than a respectable young widow fulfilling her religious obligations. It was after the service, during the inevitable gathering in the churchyard, where parishioners exchanged pleasantries and discussed parish matters, that Miss Marple positioned herself where she might observe both Edwin and Clara without appearing to do so deliberately. Lady Bantry, understanding her friend's methods, engaged the vicar in conversation about the church restoration fund, providing useful cover. Miss Marple was rewarded when Mrs. Dane, the grocer's wife, approached Edwin with what appeared to be a question about the church hall's availability for a meeting of the Women's Institute. "Such a convenient space," Mrs. Dane was saying as Miss Marple drifted within earshot, "and we do appreciate your flexibility about lending the key, Mr. Lorimer. I understand you were equally accommodating to poor Agnes Fuller when she needed additional room for her work." Edwin's response came without hesitation, his tone remaining pleasantly neutral. "I'm always happy to facilitate when I can. The church exists to serve the community, after all. Agnes was a valued parishioner who occasionally required more space than her cottage could provide. It seemed only natural to assist." Quite right, Mrs. Dane agreed. "Though I must say I never quite understood why she needed extra space. Sewing doesn't require vast rooms, surely." "I couldn't say with any certainty," Edwin replied, and Miss Marple noted the precision of his phrasing. Not, "I don't know," but "I couldn't say." A subtle distinction suggesting knowledge that could not or would not be shared. Agnes conducted her business as she saw fit, and I asked no questions. It wasn't my place to inquire into the details of her commissions. The conversation moved on to other topics, and Miss Marple found herself reflecting on Edwin's careful words. There was nothing dishonest in what he had said, yet everything was phrased to reveal as little as possible while maintaining an appearance of openness. It was the speech of a man accustomed to keeping confidences, or perhaps more precisely, of someone who understood the value of strategic silence. She turned her attention to Clara, who had been drawn into conversation with Miss Hartnell, the village's most determined source of gossip and speculation. Miss Hartnell was holding forth on the subject of Agnes's death with the air of someone who considered themselves an authority on all the village matters. "Such a peaceful passing," Miss Hartnell was saying, "though I must confess I've been puzzling over that coat she was working on. No one seems to know who it belonged to. You've been sorting her things, haven't you, Mrs. Mayhew? Surely you must have some idea." Clara's response was measured and polite. "I'm afraid Agnes kept very few records with names attached. She was quite particular about discretion, as I'm sure you understand. Many of her clients valued their privacy. But surely, for a commission that extensive, there must have been some correspondence, a receipt perhaps, or a note about the specific requirements." "If there was, I haven't discovered it," Clara said, and Miss Marple observed the way she held herself, composed but not rigid, engaged but maintaining a careful distance. Agnes had her own methods, and I wouldn't presume to understand them completely. She was far more experienced than I am in such matters. "Still, it seems odd," Miss Hartnell persisted. "A coat altered so carefully, and then simply left unclaimed. One wonders what the story might be." "I imagine," Clara said with a slight smile, "that the story is likely quite ordinary. Someone commissioned work and then circumstances changed. It happens more often than one might think in any trade. Miss Marple noted the phrase, circumstances changed, another carefully chosen expression that could mean anything or nothing. Clara was as practiced as Edwin in the art of saying little while appearing to say much. After the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple walked slowly home, her mind occupied with the morning's observations. She was reminded of a case many years ago in her nephew Raymond's parish, where a curate had been protecting a confidence that involved a matter of considerable delicacy. The young man had spoken of the situation in exactly the same way, with careful precision, revealing nothing while maintaining the appearance of openness. It was this memory that prompted her to pay a call on Clara the following afternoon. The October sunshine had given way to grey skies again, and a light mist hung over the village, lending it a soft, muted quality. Clara received her with tea and what appeared to be genuine pleasure at the company, though Miss Marple detected an underlying wariness in her manner. "I've been thinking about what you said," Clara began once they were settled. "About restoring the coat to its original state. I examined it more carefully over the weekend, and I believe it could be done without too much difficulty. The false hem, particularly, is easy enough to remove." "I'm glad you found a solution that satisfies you," Miss Marple said warmly. "Though I confess I've been curious about something. You speak of Agnes with such consistent gratitude and respect, yet never with the sort of familiarity one might expect from neighbours who lived beside each other for months. It's always Agnes was rather than Agnes used to or Agnes told me, the grammar of distance rather than intimacy." Clara set down her teacup with careful attention. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean." "Only that the way we speak about people often reveals the nature of our relationship with them. When we speak of someone we knew, well, our language becomes more casual, more filled with specific memories and personal anecdotes. But when we speak of someone whose work we valued without necessarily sharing the details of their life, our language remains more formal, more grateful than familiar." "Agnes was a private person," Clara said after a moment. "She didn't encourage intimacy, even with those who lived nearby. I respected that." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed, "though I suspect there was more to it than simple privacy. I think Agnes kept herself apart from those she helped, because maintaining that distance was essential to maintaining their confidence. One cannot be both confidant and friend without risking confusion about which role takes precedence." Clara met her gaze directly. "You're very perceptive, Miss Marple." "I'm very old," Miss Marple corrected gently, "and I've observed a great many people over a great many years. One develops a sense for the patterns of human behaviour, and I've noticed that both you and Mr. Lorimer speak of Agnes in remarkably similar ways, with respect and appreciation, but always maintaining that same careful distance, always phrasing your words with precision, as though you've both learned that what one doesn't say is often as important as what one does." "Mr. Lorimer?" Clara's surprise appeared genuine. "I hadn't realised he spoke of Agnes with any particular pattern." "Oh, very much so. This morning after church, he was asked about lending the church hall to Agnes. His response was perfectly cordial but revealed nothing about the nature of her work there or why she needed the space, just as your responses about the coat reveal nothing about whose coat it is or why it required such extensive alteration." Clara was silent for a long moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "What is it you want to know, Miss Marple?" "I want to understand what Agnes was protecting," Miss Marple said, simply. "Not to expose it or to judge it, but to ensure that whatever she began is properly concluded. You see, my dear, I believe Agnes died before her work was complete. Not the physical work of sewing, that was nearly finished, but the larger work of helping someone through a difficult transition. And I think that work still needs completing, but you're unsure how to proceed without betraying the confidence Agnes kept." "Yes," Clara said softly, "that's exactly the difficulty. Agnes would have known how to manage it all. She had such wisdom about these matters, such understanding. But I don't have her experience or her judgment. I'm afraid of doing harm through good intentions." "Then perhaps," Miss Marple suggested, "we should discuss what Agnes understood that made her so skilled at helping people through their complications, because I suspect that understanding lies at the heart of this entire matter." Clara looked at her for a long moment, clearly weighing her words. Then she rose and moved to the window, looking out at the misty afternoon. "Agnes understood," she said quietly, "that sometimes people need to change how the world sees them. Not because they're being dishonest, but because the way the world has seen them no longer matches who they truly are. And she understood that such changes require not just skill with needle and thread, but compassion and absolute discretion." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "I rather thought it might be something like that." The afternoon light filtered through the mist, casting everything in soft, indistinct tones, and in that gentle obscurity, truth began to take shape more clearly than it had in all the bright, revealing sunshine of the previous weeks. Chapter 8. The Purpose of the Locked Workbox. The locked workbox had been mentioned only once in passing, and Miss Marple might have overlooked its significance entirely had Clara not returned to the subject 3 days after their conversation about how Agnes had understood the need for transformation. "I've been thinking," Clara said when she called at Miss Marple's cottage on Thursday morning, "about Agnes's workbox, the small mahogany one that she kept beside her chair. I noticed it when I was sorting her things, but I set it aside because it was locked and I couldn't find the key among her effects." Miss Marple set aside her knitting and gave Clara her full attention. "And now you've found the key?" "In a manner of speaking. It was sewn into the lining of her sewing basket, a small pocket she had made, quite cleverly concealed. I discovered it quite by accident when I was examining the basket to determine whether it should be kept or given away." "How very like Agnes," Miss Marple observed, "to keep something important in a place where only someone who understood needlework would think to look. Did you open the box?" Clara hesitated, and Miss Marple saw uncertainty cross her features. "I did, but I confess I'm not entirely sure what to make of the contents. I wondered if you might look at them with me. A fresh perspective, you understand." They walked together to Clara's cottage, where the workbox sat on the table in the small sitting room. It was indeed a handsome piece, mahogany with brass fittings, the sort of workbox that a careful needlewoman might keep for special items or precious tools. The lock was small but well made, and the key that Clara produced from her pocket was delicate and ornate. "I haven't removed anything," Clara said as she turned the key. "I thought it best to leave things as Agnes arranged them." The lid opened smoothly to reveal an interior, lined with faded blue silk. The contents appeared modest at first glance. A card of spare buttons in various sizes and colours, a stub of tailor's chalk worn down to perhaps an inch in length, several needles stuck into a small felt pad, and a folded piece of paper that had been placed with obvious care beneath the other items. Miss Marple examined each object in turn, noting the quality of the buttons: mother-o'-pearl, horn, and what appeared to be jet. These were not the ordinary buttons one might purchase at any draper's, but rather the sort that might be salvaged from garments of some quality or age. "The buttons are interesting," she murmured, "each quite distinctive. The sort one might keep if they had particular associations or if they were needed to match a specific garment." "I thought the same," Clara agreed, "though I couldn't determine which garments they might have belonged to. Agnes kept very few clothes herself, and none that would have required buttons of this quality." Miss Marple turned her attention to the chalk stub. It was blue rather than white, and the edges bore the marks of considerable use. "Tailor's chalk comes in several colours," she observed. "Blue for marking dark fabrics where white would show too clearly. Agnes must have used this piece for quite some time to wear it down so far. One doesn't generally save such things. Chalk is inexpensive enough to replace, which suggests this particular piece had some significance to her." She set the chalk aside gently and reached for the folded paper. It was good quality stationery, slightly yellowed with age but still crisp along the folds. Clara watched as Miss Marple opened it, her expression revealing both curiosity and apprehension. The letter was written in Agnes's characteristic hand, though the writing was less steady than the examples Miss Marple had seen in the seamstress's notebook. Perhaps it had been written when Agnes was tired, or perhaps emotion had affected the firmness of her script. Miss Marple read aloud, slowly and with careful attention to each phrase. "I have completed what was asked of me, though the work has taken longer than either of us anticipated. The alterations are sound and will serve their purpose well. I hope that in doing this work I have helped someone stand as they must be seen, rather than as circumstance once required them to appear. There is a difference between disguise and revelation, and I have always believed that my needle might serve both purposes. What was hidden may be shown, and what was shown may be returned to its proper state when the time comes. I know that time is not infinite. I feel its weight more each day. If I should not finish before time takes the choice away, I trust that those who understand will complete what I began. The measurements are all recorded. The method is clear. What remains is only courage and compassion." The letter was unsigned and undated, though the paper showed signs of having been handled repeatedly, the edges softened by touch. Miss Marple refolded the letter carefully and placed it back in the workbox. "This was never sent," she said quietly. "It was written, I think, as a sort of testament. Agnes wanted to record her understanding of what she was doing and why." "Yes," Clara said softly. "That's what I thought as well. She was preparing for the possibility that she might not live to complete the work, making sure that someone would understand the purpose behind it all. Stand as they must be seen, rather than as circumstance once required them to appear," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "That's a very particular phrase. It suggests that the person Agnes was helping had been constrained by circumstance to present themselves in a way that was not true to their nature. And now they wish to be seen as they truly are," Clara added, "or perhaps as they have always been beneath the surface." Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, looking out at the garden, where autumn had begun its quiet work of transformation. The leaves were turning, the flowers fading, everything moving from one state to another in the natural progression of seasons. It was not unlike what Agnes had been helping someone achieve, a transition from one state to another, guided by understanding and skill. "Tell me," she said, turning back to Clara, "about the buttons. Do you recognize them?" Clara came to stand beside the workbox, examining the buttons more closely. The mother-of-pearl ones are the sort that might come from a gentleman's waistcoat. Good quality, but not ostentatious. The horn buttons could be from almost anything, a coat, a jacket, but these jet ones— she picked up a black button and held it to the light— these are rather fine, the sort one might find on a morning dress or a formal coat, or a garment that had been altered from one purpose to another, Miss Marple suggested. Buttons that might need to be replaced or repositioned when changing a man's coat into a woman's, or vice versa. Clara looked at her sharply. "You've worked it out, haven't you?" "I believe I understand the essential truth," Miss Marple said gently, "though I confess the specific details remain somewhat obscure. Agnes was helping someone alter their appearance in a fundamental way, not to deceive but to reveal, not to hide truth but to express it. And she understood that such work required not just technical skill, but profound compassion and absolute discretion." She returned to the workbox and examined the buttons once more. "These buttons represent different stages of the work, I think. Evidence of transformations undertaken and completed. Agnes kept them as a sort of record, or perhaps as a reminder of the importance of what she was doing. She helped others before," Clara said quietly, "years ago when I first knew her. The work I mentioned that she did for me, it was of a similar nature, though not quite the same. I needed a garment altered to hide rather than to reveal. I was young and frightened, and Agnes helped me without judgment or questions. She simply did what was needed and kept my confidence." Miss Marple nodded slowly, understanding the parallel. "And so when you returned to the village and found yourself living beside her, you recognized in her the same quality that had helped you years before. Someone who understood that people's lives are often more complex than they appear, and that sometimes assistance of a very particular kind is needed." "Yes, and when she began this current work, the coat, the fittings at the church hall, all of it, I knew she was helping someone else through a similar difficulty. I didn't know who and I didn't ask, but I understood what she was doing and why it mattered. Miss Marple returned to her seat and picked up the letter once more, reading through it silently. "If I should not finish before time takes the choice away," she read again. Agnes knew she might not live to complete the work, but she also knew that others would understand and could finish what she had begun. "The question," Clara said, "is whether we should finish it, whether it's our place to intervene, or whether we should simply let the matter rest as it is. I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that we should be guided by what Agnes herself would have done, and I believe Agnes would have ensured that the work was completed properly, that the person she was helping was able to make their transition with dignity and without unnecessary difficulty." She closed the workbox and handed the key to Clara. The buttons, the chalk, the letter, these are all pieces of a story about transformation and courage, about someone who needed help standing as they must be seen, and about a seamstress who understood that her needle could serve truth just as well as it could serve deception. "Then you know who it is," Clara said. It was not quite a question. "I believe I do," Miss Marple replied, "though I think it would be better if the truth emerged naturally without any dramatic revelation. These matters are always best handled with gentleness and understanding." "Yes," Clara agreed quietly. "Agnes would have wanted that." And in the silence that followed, both women understood that the time for careful observation was drawing to a close, and that the time for compassionate action was approaching. Chapter 9. What Science was meant to protect. The conversation that resolved the matter took place not in any dramatic setting, but in Miss Marple's sitting room on a grey Saturday afternoon, when the village was quiet and the likelihood of interruption minimal. Clara had requested the meeting, arriving at precisely 3 o'clock with the air of someone who had reached a decision after considerable thought. Miss Marple had prepared tea as usual, but neither woman touched their cups immediately. There was a quality to the silence that suggested important things were about to be said, and both recognised that such moments required their own pace. "I've been thinking about what you said," Clara began at last, her hands folded in her lap, "about allowing truth to emerge naturally, with gentleness and understanding. And I've realised that the truth can only emerge if someone speaks it. Agnes kept silence to protect, but her silence can no longer serve that purpose. The work is unfinished, and it will remain unfinished unless someone completes it." "And you believe you're the one to complete it?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I believe I'm the one who must speak," Clara corrected. "The completion itself will require other hands, other decisions, but the speaking, that falls to me because I'm the one Agnes trusted with enough knowledge to understand." Miss Marple poured tea for them both, the familiar ritual providing a gentle counterpoint to the weight of the conversation. "Then perhaps you should tell me what Agnes understood that made her silence necessary." Clara accepted her teacup but did not drink. Instead, she looked at it as though reading something in the pale amber liquid. "The coat was not for me," she said quietly, "though I let people believe it might have been, because that seemed easier than the truth. It was for Edwin Lorimer, or rather, it was Edwin Lorimer's coat being altered so that it might be worn in public again without drawing notice." Miss Marple remained silent, giving Clara space to continue at her own pace. "Edwin is—" Clara paused, searching for the right words. "Edwin has always been what the world saw, a respectable gentleman, a churchwarden, someone comfortable with authority and order. But that presentation required considerable effort, considerable constraint. Years ago, when circumstances demanded it, Edwin had to alter how he appeared to the world. Agnes helped him then, just as she was helping him now. To return to an earlier state," Miss Marple said softly, "to undo what had been done out of necessity. Yes, the coat that Agnes was working on had been altered many years ago from a woman's coat into a man's. Agnes had done that work herself, with the same skill and discretion she brought to everything. She had helped Edwin present himself as a man because that was what circumstance required, what society demanded. But now, after so many years, Edwin wished to undo that. Soon, To return to how things had been before necessity intervened, Clara set down her teacup with careful precision. Agnes was altering the coat back to its original form, removing the changes she had made years before, restoring it to what it had been. It was to be worn only privately at first, I believe, a step toward a larger change that Edwin was contemplating. But Agnes died before the work was complete, and Edwin was left with a coat that was neither one thing nor the other, not fully transformed back, but no longer in its altered state either. Miss Marple considered this carefully, and the measurements taken twice. One set for Edwin as he appears now, the other for Edwin as he was before, as he wishes to be seen again. The body changes over time, even when the fundamental truth remains the same. Agnes needed both sets to ensure the coat would fit properly once the alterations were complete. And the church hall? Miss Marple prompted gently. Edwin couldn't go to Agnes's cottage for fittings. Too visible, too likely to cause comment. And Agnes couldn't go to Edwin's home for the same reason. So Edwin arranged for them to use the church hall in the evenings, when it would be empty and private. He had the authority to make such arrangements without questions being asked. Miss Marple nodded slowly, the pieces falling into place with the quiet certainty of a puzzle nearing completion. So Agnes was helping Edwin prepare for a transformation back to his authentic self, and she died before that work was finished, leaving Edwin in a rather difficult position. Yes, the coat exists in a state that reveals everything and resolves nothing. It's clear evidence of transformation without being suitable for use. And Edwin can hardly come forward to claim it without revealing the entire story to the village, which is precisely what Agnes's discretion was meant to prevent. Hence your suggestion that the coat be donated, Miss Marple observed. That would remove it from circulation quietly without it becoming a focus of speculation. I thought it was the kindest solution, Clara said. Though you suggested something better. Restoring it fully to its original state so it can be given away as an ordinary woman's coat, of interest to no one. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. That creates its own difficulty, doesn't it? Because restoring the coat to its original form is essentially completing Agnes's work. And completing that work means making decisions about Edwin's future that perhaps should not be made by others. That's exactly the problem, Clara agreed. I don't know what Edwin wants now, whether he still wishes to proceed with the transformation Agnes was helping him undertake, or whether Agnes's death has made him reconsider, whether the courage he was building with Agnes's help has sustained itself, or whether it's faltered without her steady presence. You haven't spoken to him about it. How could I? We've never discussed the matter directly. I know about it only because Agnes confided in me years ago about similar work she had done, and because I recognised the pattern when it began again. But Edwin doesn't know that I know. To him, I'm simply the helpful neighbour sorting through Agnes's effects. Miss Marple set down her teacup and looked at Clara with sympathy. You find yourself in the position of knowing something that creates an obligation, but uncertain what that obligation requires of you. Yes, if I restore the coat to its original form and give it away, I'm completing Agnes's work without Edwin's consent. But if I leave it as it is, I'm abandoning work that Agnes clearly believed was important. And if I approach Edwin directly, I risk exposing something he's worked for years to keep private. The afternoon light was fading, and Miss Marple rose to switch on the lamp, casting a warm glow across the sitting room. The small domestic act seemed to help Clara collect her thoughts. What would Agnes have done? Miss Marple asked, resuming her seat. If she had lived, how would she have managed this? She would have spoken to Edwin privately, Clara said without hesitation. She would have asked him directly what he wished to do, and then she would have helped him do it. Agnes never made assumptions about what people needed. She asked, she listened, and she acted according to their wishes rather than her own judgment. Then perhaps, Miss Marple suggested gently, that's what you should do. Not speak to Edwin yourself necessarily, but ensure that someone does, someone he trusts, someone who can approach the matter with the same discretion and understanding that Agnes possessed. Clara looked at her hopefully. "Would you speak to him, Miss Marple? You have a way of managing difficult conversations without causing distress, and Edwin respects you. He might be willing to discuss the matter with you in a way he wouldn't with me." Miss Marple considered this request carefully. It was not a responsibility to be undertaken lightly, and yet she recognized that Clara was correct. Someone needed to speak to Edwin, to give him the opportunity to complete what Agnes had begun, or to choose a different path entirely. And it needed to be done with sufficient discretion that Edwin's dignity remained intact regardless of what he decided. "I'll speak to him," she said finally, "but I'll need you to provide me with certain information first. The nature of the alterations Agnes was making, the stage at which the work was left, what would be required to complete it. That way, if Edwin wishes to proceed, we can ensure the work is done properly." "Thank you," Clara said quietly. "I've been carrying this alone since Agnes died, and it's been rather heavier than I expected." "Secrets often are," Miss Marple observed. "Even secrets we keep for the best of reasons. Though I must say, my dear, you've managed remarkably well. Agnes chose this wisely when she placed her trust in you." Clara smiled, though tears gathered at the corners of her eyes. She was extraordinary, wasn't she? So many people passed through her hands, literally and figuratively, and she helped each of them with the same quiet competence, never judging, never revealing, simply doing what was needed with skill and compassion. "The world needs more people like Agnes Fuller," Miss Marple agreed, "though I suspect there are more of them than we realise, working quietly in their various ways to help others navigate the complications of being human." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of revelation settling into something more manageable. The truth had been spoken at last, and while it revealed complexity and vulnerability, it also revealed courage and kindness, both Agnes's and Edwin's. "When will you speak to him?" Clara asked. "Soon," Miss Marple replied. "Perhaps tomorrow after church. I'll contrive some excuse to speak with him privately. Some question about the flower rota or the autumn fete. Something ordinary that won't draw attention. And if he doesn't wish to complete the transformation, if he's changed his mind, then we'll restore the coat to its current masculine form and donate it quietly. Agnes's work will be honoured either way, either by completing what she began or by preserving what she had already accomplished. The important thing is that Edwin has the choice." Clara nodded, visibly relieved. That's what Agnes would have wanted, for Edwin to choose his own path, with help if needed, but without pressure or judgment. As Clara prepared to leave, she paused at the door and turned back to Miss Marple. "You've been very kind about all this. Not everyone would have approached the matter with such understanding." "My dear," Miss Marple said warmly, "I'm quite old enough to know that life is rarely as simple as it appears, and that people contain multitudes that don't always fit comfortably into the boxes society provides for them. Agnes understood that, and I like to think I do as well. Now go home and rest. You've carried quite enough burden for one day." After Clara had departed, Miss Marple returned to her sitting room and took up her knitting, though her fingers moved automatically while her mind was occupied elsewhere. Tomorrow she would speak to Edwin Lorimer, and together they would determine how to complete what Agnes Fuller had left unfinished. It would require delicacy and compassion, but then the most important work usually did. Chapter 10, Needle, Thread, and the Shape of Truth. The conversation with Edwin Lorimer took place on Sunday afternoon in Miss Marple's garden, where the autumn roses still held a few last blooms, and the October sunshine provided warmth without being oppressive. Miss Marple had contrived the meeting with the ease of long practice, mentioning after the church that she had some questions about the Christmas flower arrangements and wondered if Mr. Lorimer might call round when convenient. Edwin arrived at 2:30, dressed in his customary Sunday best and carrying himself with the genial authority that characterised his public presence. But Miss Marple, who had developed considerable skill at reading the small signs of inner distress, noticed the tightness around his eyes and the way his hands rested a fraction too carefully on the arms of the garden chair. They discussed the flower rota for several minutes, establishing the comfortable fiction that had brought Edwin to this garden. Then, when the necessities had been observed, Miss Marple set aside her notebook and spoke with quiet directness. "Mr. Lorimer, I wonder if I might speak to you about a rather more delicate matter. It concerns Agnes Fuller and the work she was doing before her death." Edwin's expression remained composed, but Miss Marple saw his shoulders stiffen slightly. Agnes was a valued member of our community. Her loss is felt by many. "Indeed. Though I suspect it's felt particularly keenly by those for whom she provided assistance of a more personal nature, the sort of help that required both skill and discretion." There was a long pause. Edwin looked out across the garden, his gaze settling on nothing in particular. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "I'm not certain I understand what you're referring to, Miss Marple." "I think you do," Miss Marple said gently. "And I think the burden of pretending otherwise has become rather heavy. Agnes died before she could complete the work she was doing for you, and you've been left in a difficult position, unable to claim what's yours, unable to proceed with what you planned, uncertain how to resolve a matter that was never meant to become public." Edwin turned to look at her, and in his eyes, Miss Marple saw a mixture of fear and relief. "How did you know?" "I'm old," Miss Marple said simply, "and I've observed a great many people over a great many years. I've learned to recognize the patterns of lives constrained by circumstance, and the courage it requires to change what circumstances have imposed. Agnes understood those things as well, which is why you trusted her." "Yes," the word was barely audible. Edwin's hands gripped the arms of the chair more tightly. She understood without needing explanations, without judgment or awkward questions. She simply saw what needed to be done and set about doing it. And now the work is unfinished. "Yes," Edwin's voice was steadier now, though no less quiet. "I don't know what to do." Agnes would have known. She had such wisdom about these matters. But without her, he stopped, unable to continue. Miss Marple allowed the silence to settle for a moment before speaking. Agnes left instructions in her way, a letter, unsent but carefully preserved, expressing her understanding of what she was helping you accomplish, and Clara Mayhew, whom Agnes trusted, has been sorting through the effects and trying to determine how best to proceed without causing you distress. "Clara knows?" Edwin looked alarmed. "Clara understands," Miss Marple corrected. "There's a difference. She knows what Agnes was doing and why, but she has no intention of revealing it to anyone who doesn't need to know. She came to me because she wanted to ensure that you had the choice to complete what Agnes began, or to choose a different path entirely. The decision she felt should be yours, rather than being made for you by circumstance." Edwin's expressions shifted, the rigid control softening into something closer to gratitude. "That's very thoughtful of her, of both of you." "The question," Miss Marple said, "is what you wish to do now. Agnes was altering a coat for you, restoring it to its original form after years of it being shaped to serve a different purpose. That work is nearly complete but not quite finished. If you wish, it can be completed quietly and returned to you. Or if you've reconsidered, it can be returned to its current state and disposed of discreetly. Either way, the matter will be handled with the same discretion that Agnes herself would have provided." Edwin was silent for a long moment, his gaze returning to the garden. A robin landed on the wall nearby, cocked its head at them and flew off again. The normalcy of the moment seemed to give him courage. "I've been Edwin Lorimer for 37 years, he said quietly. "I became Edwin because circumstances required it, because there was no place in the world for who I had been before. Agnes helped me make that transformation, and I've lived as Edwin ever since. A respectable life, a useful life, but not entirely my own." He paused, and Miss Marple waited with patient understanding. "I went to Agnes some months ago because I wanted to undo what we had done. Not completely, perhaps, not in a way that would cause scandal or disruption, but enough that I might have some private acknowledgement of who I truly am. The coat was to be a beginning, Something I could wear at home, alone, as a reminder that Edwin wasn't all I was or had been. And you wish to continue with that plan? I don't know, Edwin said honestly. When Agnes was alive, it seemed possible. She made it seem natural, even inevitable. But now, without her steady presence, I wonder if I was simply caught up in a moment of, I don't know what to call it, weakness, courage, both perhaps. Miss Marple considered her words carefully. I knew a woman once who spent 40 years living a life that wasn't quite her own. She made the best of it, as one does, and she was respected and useful in her community. But when she was in her 70s, she made a small change. Began using her middle name instead of her first because the middle name suited her better. It was a modest adjustment, visible to no one but herself and perhaps a few close friends, but it mattered to her tremendously. It was the acknowledgement of something true that had been set aside for decades. Edwin looked at her with careful attention. You're saying small changes can have large significance. I'm saying that authenticity matters, even in small measures, especially in small measures, perhaps. The coat Agnes was altering for you doesn't require any public announcement or dramatic revelation. It's simply a garment that reflects a truth about yourself that you've kept private. Completing that work doesn't commit you to anything beyond what you choose. It merely provides you with a choice. And if I choose to complete it, then Clara and I will ensure the work is finished properly. The coat will be delivered to you privately, and you may do with it as you wish. Wear it at home, keep it in your wardrobe, or decide later that it's not what you need. The important thing is that the choice remains yours. Edwin sat very still, and Miss Marple could see him weighing options that had probably occupied his thoughts for months, if not years. Finally he spoke with quiet resolution. I would like the coat to be completed, not because I'm certain what I'll do with it, but because Agnes believed it was important enough to undertake. She understood things about people that most never see, and I trust her judgment even now that she's gone. Then it shall be done, Miss Marple said simply. Within the week, I should think. Clara has already made arrangements with Mrs. Phelps in Much Benham, who is both skilled and discreet. The coat will be finished and returned to you without any notice being drawn to the matter. Thank you, Mr. Edwin said, and there was genuine emotion in his voice. I don't know what I expected when I came here today, but it wasn't this kindness, this understanding. You've carried a burden for a very long time, Miss Marple observed. Sometimes the kindest thing one can do is simply acknowledge that burden and offer to help with it, even in small ways. They sat together in the autumn sunshine for a few moments more, and the conversation turned to lighter matters, the upcoming harvest festival, the repairs needed to the church roof, the ordinary concerns of village life. But both understood that something significant had transpired, that a confidence had been shared and honoured, and that Agnes Fuller's work would be completed as she would have wished. When Edwin departed, he carried himself with noticeably less tension, and Miss Marple reflected that truth, even when quietly spoken, had a remarkable power to relieve suffering. 3 days later, the coat was delivered to Edwin's home in a plain brown package, with no note or marking to indicate its origin. Clara had overseen the final alterations herself, working from Agnes's measurements and following the careful instructions that the seamstress had left in her notebook. The false hem had been properly set, the shoulders adjusted, the collar reshaped. It was once again a woman's coat of modest quality and unremarkable appearance, the sort of thing that might hang in any wardrobe without drawing particular notice. Within the week, Edwin Lorimer announced his intention to resign as churchwarden at the end of the year, citing his advancing age and a desire to reduce his responsibilities. The village received this news with expressions of regret but no particular surprise. He had, after all, served faithfully for many years and was entitled to his rest. Clara Mayhew, having completed her task of settling Agnes's affairs, quietly mentioned to several people that she was considering leaving St. Mary Mead. Her husband's family had property in Cornwall, she explained, and she thought a change of scene might do her good. No one questioned this decision, and by the end of November, she had indeed departed, leaving behind only warm regards and a reputation for being helpful during a difficult time. Miss Marple, discussing these developments with Lady Bantry over tea one grey December afternoon, observed that villages were always in flux, with people coming and going according to their own needs and circumstances. "Though I shall miss Clara," Lady Bantry said. "She was a sensible woman and quite pleasant company." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "though I suspect she needed to leave. Her work here was complete, and staying might have made things awkward. Sometimes the kindest thing one can do is to step back and allow others their privacy." "And Edwin? You think he'll be all right?" "I think Edwin will manage exactly as he chooses to manage. He has choices now that he didn't have before, and that's what matters. What he does with those choices is his own affair." Lady Bantry accepted this with the good grace of someone who knew she would learn nothing more on the subject. "Agnes Fuller certainly left things complicated, didn't she?" "Agnes Fuller," Miss Marple corrected gently, "left things as resolved as they could be under the circumstances. She spent her life arranging the edges so that others might pass comfortably through the centre. That sort of work is rarely acknowledged, though it holds everything together." She picked up her knitting and resumed the steady rhythm of her needles